Hey everyone, welcome to the next monthly meeting of Tucson's of the TAAA's Astronomy Fundamentals Group. For those who are joining us for the first time, and I see a couple of names in the chat that I don't recognize. The typical format for this meeting is there are two presentations given by members of the group. One is as of last year, we were doing the first presentation on an astronomer of the month, or in this case, a group of astronomers on the month, and that'll be starting off the night with Doug presenting on Japanese astronomers. And then the other half of the meeting is typically a more focused presentation on a very specific topic. Typically doesn't follow a theme, but tonight that will be the third and hopefully final part of a presentation that Stephen has been giving on various large telescopes. I think, Stephen, where you had left off was in the 1980s. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I picked up again in 1990.
So we're going to be looking at large telescopes, including, I believe, some of the ones that are in production and haven't yet been assembled. Like
I'm going to touch on that briefly.
Yeah. Cool. So that's what we have lined up tonight. And I need to make some people a presenter so that they can actually share their screens, because I don't have their presentations. Make co-host and co-host. And without that, Doug, you are free to start your screen share whenever you're ready.
Okay. That's what I want.
And real quick before you begin, I am paying attention to the chat, so if you do have questions and don't want to interrupt the speaker, you can ask them there.
I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. So for the last, and I got the date wrong. I originally thought I was doing it in February. I'm doing it today. I'll switch the date later. I've been doing a tour of Asia. Basically, my last few presentations have been concentrating on astronomers in China and India, and tonight I'm doing Japan. Get away from our classical European astronomers, so to speak, and take a look at what the rest of the world was doing. And then I always have my comedy slide. Okay, so interesting enough, though, Japan is very different from the rest of Asia. Certainly astronomy has been around in Japan for a long time, probably going all the way back to the origins of Japanese culture. However, a lot of that early Japanese culture has been lost. And that includes finding about anything about astronomy in early Japanese culture was virtually impossible. One of the things I found out in my research, which I actually already knew this because I've been to China many times, writing in Japan did not develop independently. It was borrowed from China, essentially, around the 7th century. And likewise, much of Japanese culture was borrowed from other Asian cultures of the times. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Japan, but I have, and went to various historical sites, and their architecture and so many other aspects of their culture are virtually identical to like Chinese architecture, slight differences, but it's essentially the same construction methods and all kinds of stuff. So yeah. as a result of that, what I found out is there are virtually no records of anything dealing with Japanese astronomy, so to speak, prior to the 7th century. Much of Japanese science was influenced by other cultures since they borrowed so much. And even though Japan was very isolated, which they were right up until the 20th century, essentially, they had trade with much of the known world of the time, and they soaked up the knowledge from all the other cultures that they traded with. And astronomy was no different. They soaked up astronomy from all the other cultures that they traded with. But as I'm sure you probably already know, if you think about Japanese culture 500 years ago, or even earlier than that, it was only the very elite, you might say, the royalty, shoguns, samurai, the warlords, etc., were the only people that really got an education. And Japan, they would go so far as to import teachers from other countries, including Western Europe. And so the Japanese elite got the higher education, but the average Japanese citizen did not. The first really interesting Japanese astronomer I could find, I gotta move this table over here, okay, was a guy named, and the dumb thing that says you are screen sharing is blocking the name on my screen. Can I move that?
Shibuya Shunkai is the name.
Shibakawa Shunkai. Okay. Oh, there's the name there. Okay. Shibakawa Shunkai. Very famous Japanese scholar. He's a famous astronomer in Japanese culture, but he's most well known as a Go player. He was apparently an expert at playing Go, but he was the first official astronomer appointed during the Edo period, which is a specific period of Japanese history. He revised the Chinese calendar, a lunar solar calendar, at the request of the shoguns, and he drew up a new calendar, a Jokyo calendar, I think is how it's pronounced, which came out in 1684. And then he changed his name to that other name and retired in 1711. And like I said, he's very famous as a Go player. And there was a movie made about him, a 2012 film. My guess is you could only see it in Japan, I don't know, called The Samurai Astronomer. And the image on the right is a sketch of this gentleman, and the image on the bottom is a piece of one of his astronomical works that he published. And this is one of the star charts that he published in one of his books. And this is a globe that he created at that time period. Asada Goryu was a physician and an astronomer, and he was very much he integrated a lot of the Western astronomy ideas that came out of Europe and integrated them into the Japanese astronomy right at the end of the Edo period. He introduced a number of Western astronomical instruments and methods. And one of the things he's very famous for is that he independently confirmed Kepler's third law. So he kind of a nice, smart guy. He spent much of his career in Osaka, where he practiced medicine for a living, because I guess astronomers didn't get paid back then. And he took over his father's practice as the official physician in Osaka. Because of the Japanese government policy of seclusion, the Western scientific theory, including astronomy, was available only through obsolete Chinese works that had been edited by the Jesuit mercenaries in China much earlier. But Osada managed to construct some very sophisticated math models of celestial movements. And like I said, he is credited with an independent discovery of Kepler's third law. There is a crater on the moon named after him. Oh, this one. Takahashi. What's the rest of the name? Tasmaki. Okay.
Takahashi Yoshitoki.
Yeah. So he was born as the son of a low-ranking samurai in Osaka and followed his father into the samurai service initially at 1778. He studied under Osada Goryu, the guy I just talked about a minute ago, in 1787. At that time, the Japanese were using a lunar solar calendar, which had become increasingly inaccurate over time and had missed the forecast of a solar eclipse that occurred in 1763. On the other hand, the solar eclipse had been predicted in advance by several astronomers, one of which was Osada Goryu. So Goryu read Chinese and Western astronomy, created his own calendar, which took into account his own theories. But Takahashi was not convinced that the calendar was a complete solution. So together with a fellow mathematician and astronomer named Shigetomi, he studied the Chinese and Western calendars as well as the previous Japanese calendar. They reached the conclusion that the calendar inaccuracy was based on some assumptions that were made about celestial bodies in circular orbits, as postulated by Tycho, whereas the actual orbits were elliptical, came out of Kepler. So together with Osada and Hazan, he developed a new calendar, and that solidified his reputation as an astronomer. He became the top astronomer in Japan. In 1795, he was ordered to Edo, where he established the official Shogunate Astronomical Observatory, which I think is the first official royal observatory in Japan. He received official approval for his new calendar, was ordered to make additional astronomical observations between Edo and Kyoto to convince the influential, whatever that name is, Toshuka Makato clan, a clan of noble people to the emperor, on the validity of the changes he made in the calendar. The new calendar was formally adopted as the Kensai calendar, and it proved to be very popular, and he gained a lot of trust from the shogunate. The shogunate were like, you've all heard of shoguns, and shogunate was like their royal society, whatever, shoguns. He was still aware that the calendar was not perfect, and he stayed up all night for astronomical observations, traveled to Kyoto to speak with the clan, but all of this work that he tried to do had a bad effect on his health. He eventually developed tuberculosis. In 1802, there was a solar eclipse, and it revealed that there was a 15-minute discrepancy in the calendar. Additional observations were required to make the corrections. In 1803, he obtained a copy of a book by the French astronomer Jérôme Lalande, in which the movements of the 5 major planets was described. This work was very important to Takahashi, and it filled in the major gaps in his own calendar. And working day and night, he researched on the book for 6 months between 1803 and 1804, and he created a manuscript that was over 2,000 pages long. As a result, it caused a bad relapse in his illness, and he died in 1804 at the age of 41. Okay, who's this guy? Zembi. Can you pronounce that first name for me?
Iwahashi.
You,
Iwahashi.
yeah. This guy is born in Osaka also. He became an optician and then got interested in natural science and scientific mythology and physics. Was a scholar of Qingyuan in Kyoto. He observed the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars, and developed an instrument to calculate the movements of celestial bodies and tides called a hatengi. Now, I believe it's something similar to a sextant. I couldn't find a picture of it. And he wrote a theoretical book of astronomy called the Haitengi Zukai. He researched a number of imported optical instruments, and then in 1793, he made his first telescope. It had a very good reputation, and then he made many telescopes of Galileo and Kepler types, which were widely used among various astronomers and the feudal rulers. The feudal rulers loved to have telescopes and other expensive instruments just so that they could claim that they had the best. His descendants eventually became telescope makers for 4 generations, and I've seen some of those telescopes, and they're very well made, very extravagant instruments. And Zumbai Land, an education center for astronomy, is named in honor of him, and it's equipped with a 600 millimeter Newtonian Cassegrain reflector and has been open to the public since 1992. And there is an asteroid named after this guy. Hirayama. He studied astronomy at the Imperial University of Tokyo, graduated in 1997. He taught astronomy at the Engineering School of the General Staff Office of the Japanese Army between 1897 and 1901. In 1906, he became an assistant professor of astronomy at Tokyo University. In 1919, he became a full professor. From 1906 to 1907, he was a member of the committee that determined the border of Sakhalin after the Russo-Japanese War. In 1911, he received a doctoral degree with several papers about latitude variation. He started working on asteroids in 1905, and in 1918, he published papers, research on distribution of mean motions of asteroids and groups of asteroids, probably of common origin. He published a paper called Families of Asteroids. And then in 1928, he published Note on an explanation of the gaps of asteroid orbits. And in 1935, he published, quote, his main work called Asteroid. Big asteroid guy. There's a crater named after him. It's actually jointly named after him and Shin Hirayama. And in the asteroid 1990, Hirayama is named after him alone. Now, one of the things I noted in doing my research is that for whatever reason, maybe it has to do with the culture, or maybe it just has to do with the fact that they borrowed all the knowledge from other, they got all the astronomy knowledge from Western Europe, and they already knew about Kepler and Galileo and all this other, all the other, and Newton, and they had all this astronomy knowledge that they picked up from other cultures. Very few of their astronomers are theoretical in nature. Most of their astronomers are just observational. You go through their list of astronomers like in the 20th century, and it's a big list. They've got, if you just list all the astronomers, famous Japanese astronomers in the 20th century, there's like 100 of them. But virtually every single one of them, except for a very few, are this person discovered 33 asteroids. This person discovered 18 comets. This person, they're all observational astronomers. No, no deep theoretical astronomers, and you'll see that trend continuing here. I'm not going to have very many theoretical astronomers. This one I found just today. She's not theoretical. This is strictly observational. Hisako Koyama. This is a very famous woman astronomer, Japanese solar observer. She made observations of the sun over a period of like 50 years, 40 years, for more than 40 years, observing the sun and making sketches every day, day after day, more than 10,000 solar sketches during her lifetime. And she used the same telescope and the same method for that entire period of time. And the image down in the bottom right is showing her at her telescope. It's a 20-centimeter telescope. And then the lower inset image is showing her actually doing a sketch. She would project the image onto a piece of paper and do this sketch. But she's got a very interesting resume. Yeah, she did this for more than 40 years, more than 10,000 sketches. She's a recipient of the Oriental Astronomical Association Prize of Encouragement of Academic Research, which I assume is a big award. She graduated from an all-girls high school in Tokyo in the 30s, and, quote, in so doing, she achieved a level of education which many girls could only dream about. You remember, back then, Japan was a very feudal society, very dominated by men. And for a woman to get that kind of education was extremely rare. She got a small refractor telescope from her father, and she immediately started observing sunspots with it. In 1944, she submitted her first sunspot sketch to Issei Yamamoto, who was a professor of astronomy at Kyoto. He kind of guided her and mentored her and pushed her into it, and she began making the semi-regular sunspot sketches using that attenuated direct viewing method, which, like I said, is projecting the image onto a sheet of paper, and then she just draws what she sees on the paper. And she would document all the information on the sketch. By 1946, she was working as a professional staff observer at the National Museum of Nature and Science in Tokyo, which was then called the Tokyo Science Museum. She officially retired from the museum in 1981, but continued to contribute for 10 more years. Like it says, from 47 to 84, she documented more than 8,000 sunspot groups, which she published in 1985. And her original sketches are preserved at the museum. But what makes her very important is this. So this is just one of her sketches. That is a really nice sketch of sunspots. Look at the detail she's got in there, especially in that group on the right. That's impressive. I never did any sunspot sketches like that. And a 20-centimeter scope, 20-centimeter refractor. Well, that's a pretty big refractor. What is that, about 8 inches? Yeah, that is a good size refractor. Okay. In 2014, international team of researchers utilized her sunspot records. And with her sunspot records, they were able to reconstruct a 400-year history of sunspot activity dating from the 1610s all the way to the early 2000s. The project relied on sketches drawn by Galileo, Gassendi, Stadbaker, Schwabe, Rudolf Wolf. These are all famous sun observers. Rudolf Wolf got the Wolf cycle named after him, etc. But because her sketches were created using the same telescope and the same observation method, they used her observations as kind of, well, they say a backbone, but as a as a template for calibrating the sunspot record. So it was key to doing this 400-year record of sunspots. So that's what makes her very important.
Real quick, Doug, before you move
Yeah.
on, James posted for everyone else, James posted a link to what a Hatingi astrolabe looks like.
Okay,
inside of
it's
the
an
channel.
astrolabe?
That's what he posted. It's a
Okay,
link to a Twitter image. So those interested, take a look at that.
yeah, you could pull that up and share screen if you want before I continue. If you want to do that, should I stop sharing?
I can, sure, do that real quick.
I'll stop sharing for now. So it's kind of an astrolabe. Okay, I thought it was something like a sex.
Let me just share the whole screen. So there we go.
Pull it up. Let's see what it looks like.
I'm sharing the wrong screen. No wonder.
Okay.
Let me fix that real quick. Come on, stop. Sorry, my computer needs to be restarted because it's really laggy. Things refuse to open. Come on. Here we go. Close that. Make this a lot bigger. So you should now be seeing it.
Oh, that. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay. Interesting.
Thank you very much for sharing that, James. Back to you, Doug.
Okay. All right. A more recent gentleman, Shushiro Hayashi, Japanese astrophysicist. He did a lot of observations and did a lot of research. Born in Kyoto, enrolled at the Imperial University of Tokyo in the 1940. Earned his Bachelor of Science degree in physics in 2.5 years. Smart guy. 1942, he was conscripted into the Navy, and after the war ended, he joined a group of physicists that was led by the Nobel laureate Hideki Yukawa at Kyoto University. And then he was appointed a full professor at Kyoto University in 1957. He made a number of additions to Big Bang nucleosynthesis model that built on top of the work of Alfred Bethe and Gamow. His most famous work were the astrophysical calculations that led to what's called the Hayashi tracks of star formation. I've seen these tracks. These are the tracks that brand new stars take from where they first start shining, so to speak, until they get onto the main sequence. They go through these tracks, these vertical tracks, the blue lines on that diagram. They start out very bright, very hot, and then they go straight down, and then a little bit curved to the left, depending on the mass of the star, and that's how they get onto the main sequence. And he also came up with what's called the Hayashi limit. That's a limit on the size, the actual radius of a star. And he was heavily involved in the early study of brown dwarfs. He retired in 1984 and died in 2010. This guy is still alive. Seki. You should all know him, or at least recognize the name. He's got a comet named after him, jointly with Ikea, or Ikaya, however you pronounced it. The Great Comet of 1965, Ikaya Seki. And like I said, a lot of these astronomers are observational in nature. He's discovered 6 other comets besides that one, and a total of 224 minor planets. He is currently the director of the Gaisai Observatory in Japan, and he's often referred to as Japan's David Levy. We just had David Levy at the club meeting recently. Yeah, and his discovery of the Great Comet, of course, inspired an entire generation of Japanese astronomy enthusiasts. So, and he's the guy still alive, although he's pushing 90 by now, 93. That's the last astronomer that I've got. I thought I'd just mention a couple other things that I found out in my research.
Excuse me, Doug.
Yes.
Yes, Pete, could you go back a couple of slides? Is that possible?
Yeah.
Yeah, right there. Okay, you were talking about the diagram there. Is that like,
So
that be considered like a special case, or more so a detailed portion of the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram?
this okay, so this is a Hertzsprung-Russell diagram.
Okay,
And imagine the main sequence is that red diagonal line
right.
on the far that goes from the upper left corner to the lower right corner. And then what this is showing is new stars form at these other red line areas, that right red line, you might say. A new star pops up there and immediately starts crashing down that blue line. That's called the Hayashi. That's what do they call it? The Hayashi track.
Okay.
The
So the
new
Hayashi
star
track is just like more of a detailed look at the
Yeah, and
Hertzsprung-Russell.
if you look on the it's labeled, you see the right labels are in years. So 10
Oh,
to the
okay,
5th
yeah.
years, that's right after the star formed, and 10 to the 6th and 10 to the 7th, 10 to the 8th. So it doesn't take it very long to get down to the main sequence. It dives down to the main sequence, or dives down and goes left, whatever, and then sits on the main sequence.
Yeah, but the main variable is luminosity and temperature,
Yeah.
same as Hertzsprung. Okay,
Yeah.
very good, thank you.
But he was the one who came up with those tracks. So they're named after him. Okay, so one of the things I discovered just in the research in Japanese astronomy in general is, of course, they have their own thoughts on constellations in their culture. And this is an example. When we look at Orion, we see the Greek hunter figure. They look at Orion, there's a half a dozen different things that they might see. For example, this is one of them, this drum. There's an image of this type of drum. It's a ceremonial drum that was used for different ceremonies and for music. And they see this drum in the sky. See how that works? There's the figure and the drum and the strings and the chord and the knot across the middle. And they see this drum as one possible interpretation of a constellation. Here's another one, a more pretty one, you might say. Instead of the mighty hunter, they see the sleeves of a kimono. You see the woman with her arms outstretched and the sleeves draping down, and see in the figure on the right there, they attribute the constellation Orion to that interpretation, as a woman who's lifted her arm, her kimono sleeve, gracefully towards the southern sky. And then this interpretation is a little bit different. There was a big war between two different clans in China, and their colors were red. They had colors associated with the clans. One was red, one was white. And these two clans fought for a long time, and many stories and legends came out of these wars. Those two colors are still very meaningful in Japan. Their national flag is red and white. And so they look at Orion and they see this as a symbol of the peace between the two clans, because you've got one star, Betelgeuse, that's red, and then you've got Rigel, which represents the white, And the belt of Orion represents like the equivalent of a demilitarized zone, a zone of peace separating the two warring clans. I found that a unique interpretation of Orion. But I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit about astronomy in Japan. So that's it. That's all I've got. I'll take questions now. Any questions or comments? And I think I'm done with my tour of Asia.
Bravo, Doug. Good presentation. Enjoyed it.
I have this feeling that if I tried to do other Asian countries, like maybe Korea or something like that, that I'd run up against the same problem, that all of it is borrowed knowledge from China, essentially. I don't think I'd find much.
When I unmute my mic. And with that, since there doesn't seem to be any questions, we'll turn it over to Stephen. Steve, whenever you're ready.
I'm right here. Give me just a second to bring the presentation up. I'm going to screen share. All right. Okay. And here's my presentation for tonight. Now, let me start the actual presentation from the beginning. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I don't have my headset tonight. I'm actually in California as we speak, and don't have my little headset with me, so I'm hoping you can all hear what I'm having to say. Oh, the mic on this is usually pretty good, but it's not as good as my headset.
You're loud and clear.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Cool. All right, so this is Giant Telescopes Part 3 is the final installation of this, and it is going to cover everything that currently exists and a very tiny amount about some of the potential projects which are coming to be built slowly over the last couple of decades and possibly continuing well into this decade before they are completed. But I wanted to at least go with the operational telescopes and get them up to date. So this starts approximately 1990 and goes until the present. And a few things to think about. So we talked in the first presentation about a year ago about scopes from the beginning of large scopes dealing with everything from Galileo up to Mount Palomar. And then about 6 months ago, I was here to talk about the telescopes from Mount Palomar up until just about 1990, which is when the first scope I'll mention here comes in. The first scopes I mentioned here come into existence, and tonight we're going to finish it. So in post 1948, for 4 decades approximately, the Palomar 2200-inch Range Supreme is the largest functioning telescope on Earth. And I'm saying functioning because there were bigger scopes; they just were not very effective, as we talked about last time. But in the 1970s and 80s, interest in building something bigger was growing. The problem was how to do that. It created huge technological and financial challenges, as we'll talk about a little bit, to try and produce something bigger than 200 inches or 5 meters. The Hale telescope had maxed out what was practical in telescope building. When the Russians tried to build something bigger, it didn't work very well. However, as we talked about last time, several telescopes in the 4-meter range were built in the meantime. So the constraints on building a telescope bigger than about 200 inches were numerous. 3 of the big ones were simply the cost. Trying to build something bigger than that was, with the technology they had in hand, would have been prohibitively expensive. The mass is simply lifting and pointing heavier than 5 meters would require an enormous amount, especially before the altitude azimuth mounts became widely distributed for large telescopes. And there was the issue of mirror flexure as well, which is big mirrors of all types flex under their own weight. And heavy meters that could counteract this would be massive, but the lighter designs would be too flexible and too difficult to bring into focus, which are all problems that will eventually be solved. Three possible major solutions are presented in the 70s and 80s. One is a segmented mirrors, which are multi-elements. One is a meniscus, which are very thin for their aperture mirrors. And the third one would be spin cast honeycomb mirrors. All three suffer from the same basic problem, getting the mirrors to hold their proper shape as the telescope pointed from different parts of the sky. So because these are very big, heavy mirrors that were not very thick, at least in along the area where the how should we say, the mirror part of the mirror, so to speak, the part that is the main part of the mirror, could potentially flex quite a bit as the telescope shifted around looking at different parts of the night sky. So they had to come up with a way to keep the mirror shape perfect as they move from place to place, and also dealing with temperature changes and things like that as the telescope operated. One of the solutions that they did come up with relatively early on was the altitude azimuth mounts. Now, altitude azimuth mounts, as we talked about last time, are simple in principle. Dobsonian telescopes are a form of altitude azimuth mounts. A lot of the very low-end telescope gear, which is sold, and some high-end telescope gear, which is sold, have simple altitude azimuth mounts. They simply point up and down, side to side. The problem is that tracking objects across the sky with precision is a much bigger problem than you have with an equatorial mount. You don't simply rotate around an axis. You have to move in altitude and an azimuth to track the object across the sky. That required electronic encoders on the mounts and computers to drive the tracking system. So that was something that would be very difficult to do manually, but with the advances of computers in the 70s, it became more of a possibility to do that. As telescopes also introduced field rotation of long exposure photography and spectrography. But as I said, by the 70s, advanced computing had allowed these problems to be worked out. And the first large altitude azimuth scope was the MMT on Mount Hopkins in its original configuration as it was developed in the 70s. Other considerations was that altitude azimuth mounts could be made more compact and still hold greater weight because they didn't have to, they could be built on a platform and simply rotate right and left and up and down. And another advantage I didn't include is you can build a smaller dome around them because they don't have the massive mount sticking up above them. But this still didn't solve all the problems of mirrors sagging under their own weight. And computers, however, computers and robotics, I'm saying that in scare quotes because it's debatable if we're looking at robots or just simple machines, but this would come again to the rescue of these very large telescopes that would be built. So I need to introduce a couple terms, and these can be a little bit confusing because they sound very similar, but they're actually two very, very different things. The first is active optics, which uses computers and actuators placed under the mirror to flex in such a way that it holds the correct parabolic shape as the telescope points in different directions. And I'll have some pictures of what this looks like in a few minutes, but it's basically little devices which screw in and out or which flex in back and forth, which can move the mirror ever so slightly, but keep it at a perfect shape to know where it's pointed on the sky. This is different than adaptive optics, which is a system which is somewhat hard to explain, but it uses very advanced computers and a flexible mirror and wavefront sensors in order to compensate for the diffraction of the turbulence of the atmosphere. So detwinkle stars, so to speak, is a simple way to say it, although that's not exactly the definition of what goes on. These are two very different things. Now, most modern large telescopes have both, but it's the active optics that were critical to the next step of large telescopes. As I said, although both are used, it's the active optics which makes these really big mirrors and systems operate. So giant telescopes of the 90s and 2000s. So we'll be looking at the modern giant telescopes by technology rather than chronology, meaning that I'm going to break these up into the type of mirror that was used. Although the technologies follow a roughly chronological order. I'm going to look first at segmented mirrors, and then we're going to look at the meniscus mirrors, and finally the spin cast honeycomb mirrors. So compound hexagonal mirrors was a concept developed by Jerry Nelson at the Lawrenceburg National Laboratory in the late 70s. is basically says instead of using one huge monolithic mirror, multiple thin hexagon mirrors are ground to slightly different shapes that will form a perfect parabola. Mirrors would be aligned on a single mount and reach a single point of focus, which is different, which is a little different than the arrangement that they would have on the old MMT. But the precise shapes and positions would be altered by actuators placed behind the mirrors in the system of active octaves. So the secret of this was the mirror segment. So this image, it can be a little bit hard to interpret because you get a lot of people in the way, but over on the left and in the back are some of these hexagonal mirror segments. Now this is, I believe, taken with fisheye lens, so it distorts the lines in the room a little bit. But there is actually a bit of curvature to each of those individual mirror parts. Each individual mirror part has to be specifically shaped in a different way. Remember, we're not building a big sphere, we're building a parabola, so different parts of the curve are curved differently. And so each one had to be not exactly custom made, but very precisely made according to a specific shape in order to operate. Each of those mirrors is about, I think, 1.5 meters across, about 11 centimeters thick, and they weigh about 1,000 pounds each. So these individual units are not small by any measure, but compared to what they build, they're quite large. This is the back end of what one of those mirrors looks like. You can see some of the actuators that are attached to the back, and of course they're fit together in something that looks like this. To create a segmented mirror. Now, if this looks somewhat familiar to you guys, is because the James Webb Telescope uses a similar system for slightly different reasons to this system of segmented mirrors. The reason that they use it there is to be able to fold it into origami style and fit it in a 5-meter launch fairing. For the Keck, it was to deal with the fact that building a 10-meter single monolithic mirror was simply not practical. But that's the basic idea. It looks like a honeycomb, and each of those mirrors are about the size of the mirrors that are on the actual telescope. The first of the scopes to really use this in a significant way was the Keck 1 and the Keck 2. Keck 1 was built in 1993, or was completed in 1993, and Keck 2 was built in 1996. It's originally just going to be one telescope, and then there was an additional donation made to the organizations to create two. That was something that became an issue because a lot of the money was privately granted. There was a little bit of NSF and NASA money, but it was a telescope that was going to be used by the state of California and through the UC system, and also by Caltech. Each of these scopes is 10 meters. They are practically identical in terms of the scopes themselves. There are some differences in the instrumentation that they use, but they are and were for quite a while the largest telescopes actively in use in the world. And when they built, they were the #1 instruments out there. This is an idea of what Keck looks like on the inside. As you can see, it's a conventional kind of telescope with a secondary. The primary is the broken up parts in the honeycomb at the bottom, and then there's a secondary up at the top. Now you'll notice that this has a slightly unusual optical path that is typically used. It is capable of a Cassegrain focus in the back, but most of the instruments are too big to fit on the mount itself, or the back end of the telescope itself. So what they do is they add a third mirror that pokes up through the center of the mirror complex and beams the image out to the side towards the bottom through the point of rotation of the mount and out to what's called the azimuth focus. The advantage is you can put these very large spectrometers and cameras onto the mount itself where it's not moving, and you can build obviously very large instruments for a very large telescope this way and have them work pretty effectively. Most of these big scopes will use this system. I'll point out one exception where that was not widely used. But the azimuth focus is something a little different than some of our amateur scopes have, but is proven very effective for being able to build very large spectrographs and instruments that can be attached to the side of the telescope without having to be rotated and moved around. This is an idea, and I apologize for the fact that our pictures are all on the way, but it gives an idea of what the actuator system looks like. You have the mirror mounted above it, and then a series of a mount behind each of the mirrors, and then these little, I hate to call them robots. They're not exactly robots. They're little systems, sort of like the screws we use on our telescopes, but they're computer guided, and there are dozens of them scattered throughout the mirror. And what they do is they gently flex and tilt the mirror so that each unit comes together to form the perfect parabola as the telescope moves around the sky. The active optic system is not that different from one design to another, but there are some subtle variations depending on what kind of mirror you're working with, but the basic principle is the same in terms of how these things work. This is just a picture of the insides of the Keck telescopes. As you can see, the mirrors are, the individual mirror segments are placed so tightly together that for practice, you can't really see the segments. These aren't very good pictures. They do make a hexagonal mirror overall, at least in general shape, rather than a big round one. But for all intents and purposes, you're looking at a 10-meter mirror that functions as a single unit. It's been an extremely successful design with these telescopes. Kecks are considered some of the best telescopes ever built. Obviously, there are a few little problems with them, but for the most part, they're premier instruments to this day, even though they've been superseded slightly by some other instruments out there. And this is a look at, I believe, the back end of the Keck telescope. I'm not quite sure which one, to give you an idea of what the system looks like from behind. Another one, a telescope that was built a few years later that now reigns as the largest single mirror telescope, if you want to call it that uses the same system as Canarias, which came online in 2007. It's slightly larger than Keck. Is 10.4 meters instead of just the 10 meters. This telescope is one that technically has been in operation since 2007, but a lot of the instrumentation, as far as I could read or find, is not really, it hasn't been used quite as much as the Keck telescopes have been, but it does actually have a slight size edge over the Keck scopes. And it uses exactly the same system. If you looked at it from above, it would look almost identical to the Kecks. There's not really a big difference in the technology. Again, notice the NASMA platforms over to the left, where they can mount very large instruments and spectrographs. There's also, I'm going to call these also-rans, simply because they are telescopes of a kind. These are the South African Large Telescope and the Hobby Ellerly Telescope. South African Large Telescope is obviously in South Africa. The Hobby Ellerly Telescope is at the McDonald Observatory in Texas. These are a simplified design in that they use these segmented mirrors, but they do not move in altitude. So they're pointed at the same altitude constantly. They can rotate in azimuth, so they can rotate around the sky, but they're only pointed at certain points in terms of their altitude pointing. The way that you track an object is by moving the secondary right and left above the mirror. Now that very much limits the part of the sky that these things can see. They're also used exclusively as spectrographs. They can't really form an image in the same way that a regular telescope can, but they are both about 10 meters in diameter, which places them up there officially as some of the largest telescopes on Earth. They're much more limited in what they can do compared to something like the Keck, which can move to any point in the sky and form an image and do all sorts of other things. That is the majority of the currently existing segmented mirror telescopes that I wanted to go through. I'm also going to go through the meniscus mirrors next. They were developed by Corning Glass. And they used very thin parabolic mirrors. It saved a great deal of weight, but it still requires those actuators, the active optics on the back end, to preserve the shape. And the design has been used multiple times, but it's really limited for individual mirrors of about 8 meters in aperture. And I'm going to go through a little bit of what that looks like. This, I believe, is an image of the Subaru mirror, placed on its so that it's actually lying face down. But I like this picture simply because it gives you an idea how thin this mirror is compared to its aperture. Now, you may have remembered what the mirrors for the Palomar scopes. They were quite a bit thicker than this. These are very thin mirrors. The good thing about that is it saves a lot of weight on the telescope. The disadvantage, of course, is these things are flexing all over the place. So you have to have a lot of stability built in from the back in order to hold the shape of the mirror. So these are not necessarily in exact chronological order. These telescopes all came online within about 10 years of each other. They're some of the biggest and the best scopes out there today. One of them is the Gemini North and Gemini South. Now, Gemini North is on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Gemini South is, I know in Chile, but I can't remember the name of the mountain. In any case, this is the one on Mauna Kea. They have very interesting looking domes, which were meant to deal with both the wind shape, the shaping of the wind, and also the thermal properties of keeping the telescopes equilibrized between the day and the night. So they're meant to be fairly stable. These scopes were meant to be see fairly far into the infrared. Certainly not as far as some of the other instruments out there that exist today, but they were meant to be infrared optimized, at least for the near infrared, which is one of the reasons why they use silver coatings instead of the traditional aluminum. It's a little bit more reflective in near infrared than the traditional aluminum. This is what the Gemini looks like on the inside. They are almost identical, hence the name of the twins. The difference being where they are located. They cover almost the entire sky between them, but not one. Each one sees this particular hemisphere. There is an area, I'm sure, in the middle where they both can view, but they don't view at the same time. These are both run primarily by the National Science Foundation through the National Optical Astronomy Observatory. And AURA, which is the Association for Universities in Research in Astronomy. The NOAO is partially based across the street from Steward in Tucson. That office is still there. They're talking about moving to Hawaii and other places too, but I haven't heard anything about that being absolutely finalized yet. But in any case, the operations of this telescope are done both in Hawaii and Chile. Another very important scope, since we're talking about Japanese astronomy, is Subaru. It's slightly bigger than it came online in 1999 and is slightly bigger than the two Gemini telescopes. There's only one of them. It is on Mauna Kea in Hawaii and is built by the National Observatory of Japan. This is a really interesting dome. The Japanese went into extraordinary lengths to make this a really and one of the things they did was a whole bunch of research on what the airflow over the mountain and then from the mountain over to the telescope and back over the mountain would look like. So much that I think with the wind tunnel experiments and whatever computers were available in the 90s to build that particular dome. So the dome looks really odd to our eyes, but it is, to their thinking, pretty much optimized towards the airflow, which of course down the turbulence right in front of the telescope, and it makes a clearer picture. This is Subaru on the inside. Again, it looks a lot like the other scopes that we're looking for. You can see that, I think this may actually have the mirror taken out at for that point. It's hard to see right there, but it gives an idea of what the telescope looks like. Again, on that Alt-Az mount, it's a very massive telescope. This has some you'll notice that unlike Gemini, which tends to have just sort of a light frame, it is meant to hold up a bit of weight on the front end, which allowed them to build some very large wide field cameras that they put at a primary focus. But it is considered an outstanding telescope. The Japanese obviously are still using it, and it is, last I heard, operational and fully functional in terms of what they're doing. I know there's something called Hyper Supreme Cam that they put on it, which is a wide field camera. They were doing some cosmological work with that, but it is, as I said, an outstanding scope. Another scope is very large, is the very large telescope at Paranal in Chile. This is put on, what came online in, as you can see, it's actually 4 units. Each of those units is, I believe, 8.2 meters or 8.3 meters. I'm having a hard time seeing it because of everybody's picture, but there are 4 of them in a very large complex. It's called, they came online from 1998 to 2000.
There are 4 of the main telescopes, each named after a sky figure from the Mapuche language in Chile. Each of them is accompanied by those smaller little domes, which you'll see. I'm not going to talk as much about them, but they're kind of a cool thing. They're a interferometer for the scope. Now, in theory, the big scopes can be attached to the interferometer as well. That's rarely done. The interferometer, however, for the small scopes, those little outlier scopes, can be the scopes themselves can actually be picked up and moved from place to place along that arrangement. The scope obviously is heavily used by the Europeans. It is, as I said, the European Southern Observatory, which is one of the largest observatories and astronomical groups working in the Southern Hemisphere. And I'll come back to them in a little bit when we talk about some of the very large telescopes, which are now under construction, or at least in the planning stages, because they're very much involved with that. But Arenal has been a series of outstanding instruments. This is to give you an idea what the 4 telescopes look like on the inside. Very similar to what the others look like. These ones, again, it has the 4 different telescopes, each have their own instruments attached to them, either in the back or on those azimuth platforms. Because of that, they each have unique abilities, even though the 4 telescopes themselves are nearly identical. These are highly sought after instruments in terms of the scientific community for use. A lot of research comes out of them. The last design I'm going to go over, the spun-cast honeycomb mirrors. These were developed by Roger Angel. Of course, there's a lot of stories floating around that, some of which may be apocryphal and some of which may be real. One of the stories is that he did this originally in his backyard and created the first spin-cast honeycomb mirrors there. He, of course, I believe he's retired now or partially retired, but he was for many, many years one of the leading figures at the University of Arizona Stewart Observatory and helped put together the massive mirror laboratory, which is underneath the stadium. He's not named after him, was named after a donor, Richard Ferris, but it is very much his brainchild and product. The basic principle is to place high quality glass pieces on a honeycomb shaped mold, and I did misspell mold, I apologize. You heat the furnace to close to 1,000 degrees and let the glass liquefy to about the consistency of honey. And then the liquid glass then melts into the mold, and then you spin the entire furnace with the liquid and glass inside for months and very slowly cool it. And you let the temperatures in the mold slowly cool until the glass over the honeycomb assumes a very nice parabolic shape. Now, there's 2 advantages of this. It, of course, means that you don't have to grind that all out. It also means that you get this nice honeycomb backing, which provides a lot of structural support. When the glass is cooled down to room temperature approximately, you stop the furnace and open up the top. You disassemble the furnace and pull the blank. You pull the entire blank, all 8.5 meters of it, or 8.4 meters of it, onto its side, and use high pressure water jets to remove the honeycomb molds. And then the final part is you place the mirror back on its back. You start spinning it much more gently this time, and you use very large robots to, first of all, grind out the mirror shape and polish it. The whole process takes 3 or 4 years to complete. They are currently in the process of finishing, I believe, the last 2 mirrors of a scope I'll talk about in a few minutes. But the ones that we're talking about in his presentation were actually finished years ago. It is a very complex process, and I'll show you some graphs. Basically, the honeycomb structural support, but it still requires active optics actuators to maintain the precise shape. And the mirrors max out at about 8.4 meters. They have not built anything bigger than that in terms of individual mirrors. So here's some pictures of the process. This is them putting the glass pieces onto the mold. Unfortunately, you can't really see the mold through that picture. It's not very high resolution, but they basically stretch it out and put these glass pieces. The glass is Japanese. I did a little bit of trying to dig out what the name of the glass is, but unfortunately I couldn't find it. It's a very high quality, low thermal expansion glass. You then place the furnace pieces around it and lower the lid of the furnace onto the top of it. And then you melt the glass and start spinning the furnace for weeks and weeks and weeks. And that's a kind of the image in this case is distorted because the furnace is spinning as the liquid glass and it slowly cools. Then once you got, after several weeks of spinning, it is cooled down to a solid form. You lift up the lid and that reveals the blank underneath it. I could not find any pictures of the robot's function. I wonder if that isn't proprietary. They may not want anybody looking exactly how the process works, although they will take people down for tours down there, which seems a little bit incongruous. I don't think they want a lot of photographs of the process. This is what the mirror blank looks like once it comes out before it's necessary to complete the polishing process and the grinding process. So there's still some grinding to do even after the mirror comes out of the furnace, and then there is a little bit of, there's actually quite a bit of polishing to do to get it down to exceptionally fine precisions. These things are so precise that it is said that if it were the size of the Earth, these things would not be much bigger than, something like that. That the imperfections would be much more than an inch or two in width. Now, it does have to be very precise because it's doing a lot of work in the optical, which means that the wavelengths we're dealing with are very short. This is an image of the active optics system being assembled, I believe, for the large binocular telescope, which I'll talk about in just a minute. This is not the mirror. The mirror then is placed on top of this, and those individual little bolts that you see hold the mirror in place, and they can be use it to bend it up and down just a bit to maintain the shape. So some notable scopes that I'm not going to go into because they're very similar to the ones that I've already talked about, or because they're not really giant telescopes. Using this system, the first research telescope to employ the spin-cast honey mirror comb was the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope, also known as the VAT or the Pope scope up on Mount Grant. It came online in 1993. Apache Point has a 3.5 meter, which is very similar to one of the scopes we'll look at in a minute in terms of the mirror. I didn't include pictures of that. And a cool side note is we actually had one of Roger's blanks in our shed at Tampa for quite a few years that he did in the experimental stages of building one of these things. I believe it has been removed and sold at this point, but there's a little bit of a history attached to us. How we got it, I think it was donated to us because it was just a big mirror blank. It may be actually finished polishing, but it's not polished like it is in the lab. It was something we're used doing just the testing, the spin purpose. Another thing another scope that was built about the same time as Apache Point to the same size was the Wisconsin, Indiana, Yale NAOAO, also known as a wind telescope, 3.5 meter at Kitt Peak. This is also one of these spin cast mirrors. This was the last large telescope to be built at Kitt Peak. It is a bit smaller than the Mayall. It was built quite a few years later, partially for experiment, but also because various universities from the East and the Midwest wanted a telescope, and so here it is. It is still obviously functional. It isn't as considered a giant telescope by our modern standards, but it is a pretty good scope. This is one that is still considered a large telescope. This is the modern MMT. So on the right, you'll see an image that I believe I showed before what the MMT looked like and when it really was the multi-mirror telescope. It's not a very good image, but each of those little mirrors were about 1.4 meters across, and they beamed up to their light up to a common focus, but there were individual mirrors that beamed it all over the place. And it was a very complicated system. It was designed to get around the idea of above a 5 meter telescope without actually doing that. In the late 80s and early 90s, the thought was, why don't we just replace that with a much simpler but much larger mirror? And what you got is the image on the left, which is a 6.5 meter mirror, single mirror telescope. It still goes by the name MMT. It doesn't mean anything anymore. It just means MMT because it is it was originally the multi-mirror telescope, but it has a single mirror. It is run primarily by the Smithsonian and the University of Arizona. It's known for being one of the places where some of the first, not the first, but some of the more interesting adaptive optics experiments were done, including the first secondary that could do the adaptive optics part. Now, obviously, it has the active optics part too, but adaptive optics has been a big part of their research program up there as well. And it is on Mount Hopkins. And if you take a telescope out and look at Mount Hopkins from Tucson, you can actually see this thing poking up at the top. It's just a big square box that's, of course, several stories high. It doesn't look like much from here, but it's pretty impressive. I've seen it with binoculars before from the back of my old apartment. Then there's the Magellan 1 and 2 telescopes, which are, as far as the telescopes are concerned, very similar to the ones that it now exists at the MMT. They are run primarily by the Carnegie Institution, but also by the University of Arizona and a series of other things at, I think it's Las Campanas Observatory. They were built in 2000 and 2002. They are both 6.5 meter telescopes. There are 2 of them. They are not attached. They're obviously in separate domes and buildings, but they're still very active research telescopes for being used in the Southern Hemisphere. And of course, the big one. This one probably could deserve its own presentation on its own. Certainly, we've had a few people come through to the main presentations to talk about this telescope. I say it was started in 2005 through whenever, because although the original first light was seen in 2005. There's still quite a few instruments which are still being tweaked with, and I don't want to go into too much detail about that. It was a mint. Essentially, what you're looking at are 2 8.4 meter mirrors mounted on the same mount, and I'll show you what the inside looks like in a second, with very similar instruments either at the prime focus, which includes cameras, or at the azimuth focus, which includes an interferometer, which is, we've talked about those in previous presentations, I think a little bit. They're devices which can basically, how to describe this, they can either cancel or add to the light of coming from 2 separate sources by using a part of physics called interference. And I'll just leave it at that. The problem is they haven't quite worked out all the bugs yet, even though it's been 15 years, almost 20 now. So they are working on that. This is the idea of what the scope looks like on the inside. The light path is basically comes in from above, and you have a 2 secondaries placed above the telescope, which can bounce down to azimuth mirrors that stick up to the bottom of the telescope, and then to one of these different ports, which has several different instruments attached to it. There's different kinds of spectrophotographs, there's the interferometers, there's different cameras that can be attached. And of course, the nice thing about a ground-based telescope is you can switch out the instruments. They are constantly in the process of working with tweaking those and potentially building new ones. Each of those mirrors, though, are the biggest individual mirrors that were currently in operation. Each of those is an 8.4 meter telescope. You get it. Well, I have not seen this, and very few people who are outside the astronomy community have, because there's a lot of restrictions on who can go in there. But these always impress me as being absolutely massive in terms of their construction. The closest thing that it reminds me of is the Palomar scope, and this thing just looks like a battleship that inside a dome. It gives you an idea. Those mirrors are far bigger than the room behind me. And that's just the mirror part of the telescopes. And you can see some of the instruments that were at least placed, or the weights that were placed on to simulate the instruments on those platforms. Each one can have up to 3 or 4 instruments at the azimuth focus. And then there's also cameras built by the Italians, which can swing out in front of the telescope at the prime focus. And there's also the secondaries, and I know that they were working on adaptive secondaries for this particular telescope too. So if they can ever get all the parts to work together at the same time, it has enormous potential, but they're still working on, I know, some of those instruments. And this is the very brief talk about some of the scopes which are coming up, and I didn't want to go into too much depth with them because they're all facing various kinds of problems. So this is just gives a size chart of everything that's been proposed. The four the green ones on the towards the center left are to give you an idea of what this looks like. Those are the four telescopes for the very large telescope. The blue one above it, the 2-1 is what the large binocular telescope looks like. So that's the state of the art right now. Over to the right, there are a couple scopes that I do want to mention. One is the Giant Magellan Telescope, which is the thing that looks like a flower towards the bottom. That is one that the University of Arizona is very actively involved with. It is almost completed, I think, 5 out of the 7 mirrors, and they're working on number 6 right now at the last news that I saw. The idea there is that each of those mirrors forms part of a parabola that forms the entire mirror, and then there's the Cassegrain potential for a Cassegrain focus at the bottom. I guess it's they'll probably stick a Nasmyth mirror up through the middle of that. It is the smallest of the very large telescopes which are under construction or at least planning. One that I want to mention is up at the upper right is the what's it called? I'm drawing a blank. The 30-meter telescope. That scope has run into a lot of political problems. It was meant to be a very large type of, sort of like a very large keck. It uses those segmented mirrors. It had a lot of advanced technology. The problem is they were going to build it on Mauna Kea, and a lot of the native holders were upset about the way that the folks building that telescope had gone about their business. And at this point, they're still sort of slowly going ahead with Mauna Kea, but they're also looking at the Canary Islands as a potential alternative, which of course puts the project behind by quite a few years. All these projects are delayed at this point. Both the Giant Magellan Telescope and the 30-meter telescope. The really big one in green is the European Extremely Large Telescope. Now that one is making some progress, but it too is going to be several years before that one sees first light. It, like the Keck and the 30-meter telescope, uses a segmented mirror rather than huge monolithic mirrors. It is up to 40 meters, or approximately I think it's 39 meters that they're looking at for that particular mirror, which is absolutely massive. And then in the background, there's sort of a shaded figure of a 100-meter, the overwhelmingly large telescope. That really is just a pipe dream at this point. There's some talk of getting a big international consortium together to build that. There are a lot of technological challenges before we can talk about a 100-meter optical telescope, but that's thought with these segmented mirrors about how big you could take it.
Not to mention the ongoing problems with satellites.
Yes, and all these scopes are going to face, and that actually brings up a good point, which is towards the center, there's an annulus there, a little ring. That is going to be the LSST, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, also known as the Ferris Telescope. That scope is almost complete. It is going to be we'll see first light either by the end of this year or the beginning of the next. It is meant to be a very large survey telescope like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, but without the spectrographs. The problem is it is meant to receive a very wide field of view, which means that it's going to be very susceptible to the satellite constellations, which are going to be put up at the same time that this thing is being built. There's a lot of controversy. I was just reading about that in Sky Telescope and Astronomy this last couple of months about those satellites. Elon is saying he's going to paint them black and put them in a nice orbit where they aren't quite as pesky, but that's questionable as to how well that's going to work. And that's just looking at the optical effects. These things are also blasting radio waves all over the place, which is going to affect some of the radio telescopes. So that would be a great presentation if anybody wants to do that one night on the effects of the modern satellites, super constellations on astronomy, because it's going to affect us too in terms of that. But I don't have any pretty pictures of those just because I didn't want this presentation to go on for another 25 minutes. But that might be a great presentation too. It's going to talk about the future of giant telescopes. That is my presentation for tonight. I know I went through it fairly quickly. Any questions?
Great presentation, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Cool. I'm gonna stop screen sharing.
Hey, Stephen, I do have one question. Regarding location of scopes, it seems as though just about everything's down in Chile these days, in the Andes and the Atacama and over in Hawaii. Any other ideal locations or? And I know
Antarctica.
that's maybe a little bit outside the scope of your presentation, but I was just
Yeah.
sort of curious since you looked.
It's
at all
actually
these.
a great place to build telescopes, at least in certain wavelengths, would be Antarctica, because the air is so cold and so dry that the stratosphere reaches a very low altitude there. And of course, you have to deal with the wind and things like that on the plane there. But that is one place where there's a pipe dream to put a lot of radio and short wavelength radio telescopes, because it would be ideal for things like sub-millimeter observing. In fact, there is already the Antarctic telescope, or the South Pole telescope, is already there. The problem is it's so remote that it's very hard to bring in equipment there, and so there's limits to how much you could do. There's also talk about building those things in Greenland. In fact, there's a dish that they're trying to assemble there as part of the global network that images the Event Horizon telescope. But part of the reason that it took them so long to get to Mauna Kea and Chile was that those places were very remote up until recently. In fact, they're still very remote, and it's hard to get equipment there. At least until recently. Now, Mauna Kea is probably not going to see a lot of more big telescopes built on it. The politics are simply that that has sort of become if the 30-meter telescope gets built there, it'll be something of a miracle. Just because the situation is that people on the island don't want it there. They see it as intrusive to their culture and damaging to the environment, and people have to respect that. So it's become a big political issue, and I don't see many more big telescopes being built there, which is unfortunate because it is the best site in the Northern Hemisphere. So there's that going on too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And I got done just in time.